I'm happy to introduce to you our final speaker, Emily Pugh. And speaking of computer vision, we'll be talking about photography unbound, computer vision as praxis. Let me tell you a little bit about Emily. Emily Pugh is a principal research specialist at the Getty Research Institute, where she oversees the GRI's Digital Art History Department. Pugh is active as a specialist in digital art history and an architectural historian. Her expertise within digital art history centers on emerging art and architectural history practices, and in particular, those related to imaging technologies, such as 3D scanning, computer vision. Her publications include the 2014 book, Architecture, Politics, and Identity in Divided Berlin, essays for journals including Photographies and the Art Bulletin, as well as contributions to the 2023 edition of Debates in Digital Humanities, and a forthcoming book on Ed Ruscha's Streets of Los Angeles archive. Her work in architecture and digital art history has been supported by the Center for Architecture, Theory, Criticism, History at the University of Queensland and the Humboldt University in Berlin, where she served as the 2022-23 Rudolf Arnheim Visiting Professor. Please welcome Emily.
Thank you for that kind introduction, and thank you to Thierry and all your co-organizers for putting together this wonderful 3 days of conversation. Congratulations to us all for making it this far. I am honored to be the last speaker. So here we go. I'm going to start with Joan Schwartz, which seems appropriate for Toronto. In her important article, Records of Simple Truth and Precision, Photography, Archives, and the Illusion of Control, scholar Joan Schwartz persuasively argues that those who encountered photography even 1 and 2 decades after its introduction to the world seemed immediately to understand that the technology would have far-reaching implications. They saw that its effects would be felt in a wide variety of fields and sectors, from the industrial and commercial to the creative and scholarly, and that, in, quote, extending the powers of human observation, it would fundamentally shift how humankind thought about the image. Schwartz's description of photography's reception throughout its first decades maps fairly neatly to present discourses around artificial intelligence, as a quick scan of recent articles on the topic in the New York Times reveals. We know it will change much of our world and that it has already begun to do so. However, because the technology has not been fully instrumentalized or integrated into our world, excitement and dread regarding its use is primarily, quote, a matter of expectation and a subject of speculation. AI is, like Schwartz describes photography in 1839, quote, a process in search of a practice. Certainly, as we've seen these 3 days, there is still much to learn regarding the potential and risks of AI, as well as more specifically of computer vision as tools for managing, describing, providing access to, and conducting research on photographs. While we seek to understand CV's utility vis-a-vis photographic research, there's also an opportunity at this moment to actively shape its use. What I would like to outline for you this afternoon are some aspects of a critical approach to the methodology of CV's use for the management and study of photographs. Specifically, I argue that even as we attempt to deploy CV as a tool on discrete sets and types of images, we must also, and at the same time, study CV itself. We must regard CV in relation to photography, not only in terms of a tool and the thing the tool is acting on in a kind of hammer and nail relationship, but as two aspects of the same historical and technological lineage. Such an approach not only facilitates a more critical use of CV, it also allows one to consider broader questions of how the tools and the practices with which we apply research methodologies shape and are shaped by the kinds of answers or outcomes we are seeking. I will illustrate this critical approach using the example of Photography Unbound, a collaborative research project I have been working on with 3 colleagues. David Ogawa, a photo historian and professor at Union College, Tracy Stuber, formerly a postdoc at the Getty Research Institute and currently digital humanities specialist at Harvard University, and Alexander Supartono, a photo historian and professor at Napier University in Edinburgh. Our project focuses on a corpus of 30,000 images drawn from photographic albums in the collections of 9 repositories in the US, Europe, and Asia. This corpus represents a cross-section of photography in the first 90 or so years of its existence, representing multiple image and institution types, different subjects and processes, and a variety of use contexts, from the artistic to the anthropological. The corpus of images is, while by no means comprehensive, certainly extensive. The choice of subject is an important way we've sought to critically engage with both photography and CV. Okay. Correct. Namely, we chose photographic albums because of the ways they reflect systems of collecting, grouping, and sequencing images. Portrait albums served emergent modern notions of individual identity. Travel albums circumscribed monuments and spaces. Scientific albums cataloged and inventoried specimens. On a larger scale, the 19th century also saw the emergence of photographic archives, from police systems of photometric identity to ethnographic archives and art historical image collections. As diverse as these groupings may be, they all reflect efforts to structure the relationships between photographs. The need to describe, catalog, and organize images was prompted by the vastly increased pace of image production enabled by photography. At the same time, it was this interest in standardizing, verifying, and organizing information that itself helped drive the development of the technology. This is, of course, the topic of Schwartz's article, Records of Simple Truth and Precision, which examines the, quote, shared paradigmatic origins of photographic and archival practice. The material and immaterial information systems through which photos are managed and accessed are as much a part of photography and its global system as the images themselves. The same is true of CV. In the context of Photo Unbound, therefore, our central research question is, how can we understand photography in the 19th century in terms of individual images and prints, but also as a global and interlocking system of infrastructures, of people, of technologies, of economies, of epistemologies? Photography's relationship to imperialism and racism and how it is made manifest in and perpetrated by this system is also of particular interest. Not a good time to laugh. Our use of CV techniques provides a way of viewing and understanding the global system of photography on a broader macroscopic scale, of seeing photography globally. At the root of the project is an analysis of how images in all their forms both represent and produce knowledge in the context of both photography and CV. The question of photography as a global system is one example of how the intellectual and technical framing of Photo Unbound is designed to bring CV and photography into productive juxtaposition. Another example is our focus not only on specific photo historical questions, but explicitly on questions of practice and methodology. David and Alex are concerned principally with questions of photo history related to the photographer William Stillman in David's case, and Cassian Cephas in Alex's. Tracy and I focus more on questions of practice and methodology, such as what are, or are there, research questions that one would need tens of thousands of images to investigate. Moreover, practically speaking, how might scholars manage the larger scale of images and data required to carry out such a project? These two avenues of research, the one centered in photo history and the other on emerging research practices, and in particular CV, are deeply intertwined and shape each other, perhaps even more than I had realized at the start of the project. To begin to address these questions and analyze the corpus of images we assembled for Photo Unbound, we contracted a CV firm to help develop and execute appropriate tasks for analyzing our corpus of images. After some experimentation and discussion, we settled on person detection, determining whether and how many people were present in a photo, we reasoned, could shed light on the pictorial strategies of photographers represented in the corpus, including Stillman and Cephas. Working with the CV firm, we were able to refine a custom-trained algorithm to identify whether there were people in the image, but also reliably differentiate between living figure and sculpture or relief. In addition, we decided fairly early on in the process to exploit the ability of the computer to calculate coverage, or pictorial real estate given over to figures. Once the photos had been processed, we loaded them into Dataset, an open source tool for exploring and publishing data. In this way, we could each browse the corpus on various facets of both image data as well as CV-generated and collections metadata. I want to focus on one view in particular, which relates to the term portrait, and which provides a concrete example of how we have surfaced and began to address the tensions around identification versus identity that came up in the discussion yesterday. This image shows the corpus arranged by figure coverage, beginning with the images in which the most amount of pictorial space is taken up by the figure. Sorting the corpus in this way yields some predictable results. In particular, conventional portraiture rises to the surface. Yet at the same time, sorting by coverage, we realized, juxtaposed images that would ordinarily not appear together in a repository, either physically or in a collections interface. In addition, it showed us, in one view, many images that were likely labeled the same way as portraits, and in doing so, created a data visualization that challenged and complicated the genre of portrait, as it has been understood in Europe and North America. For example, while many of the images correspond to what we think of as a portrait in the art historical sense, others appear to be photos of supposed ethnographic types, such as this portrait of a man with filed teeth from an album of photos of the Dutch Indies found in the World Museum in Rotterdam. This is a photograph of a specific individual that corresponds roughly to the formal conventions of portraiture. And yet, calling it a portrait has the effect of de-emphasizing the extent to which it is both othering and generalizing its subject, making a single person stand in for a category of humanity. Now, it can be dangerous to read too much into such labels. At times, they reflect common understandings of such images and can be chosen based on, for example, the search terms a particular institution might expect the majority of researchers to use. And anyway, scholars are trained to consider how institutional context can shape their interpretation of a collection. The collection type, art museum versus archive versus ethnographic collection, is a piece of valuable contextual information that influences how we search, what terms we use, and how we interpret the results. A term like portrait provides general indications of what a photo might look like, and we know that such a label should not be interpreted too literally. However, when does a term stop being merely a useful abstraction that enables discovery and become a barrier to analysis, or even more insidious, function to distract us from what's really happening in the image? While this is a question I might have considered before this project, I don't know that I would have known how to research it. After all, we mostly navigate such terms and their variable meanings in relation to relatively small numbers of photos and within individual institutions. In the case of Photo Unbound, something different happened, however, when we extracted many, many photos and placed them into a comparative framework with photos from other collections in different parts of the world, and in ways that both did and did not align with standardized descriptive labels. And I should mention here that, of course, in some cases you see the same photograph in different collections that's described in different ways, depending on the collection. This approach, it seemed, might be one way to study and compare collections' information systems at a high level. We can approach this question from another way as well. Looking at the number of figures across institutions, we see charts that suggest, for example, the preference for portraiture in the Getty Museum's collection. We see that images with no figures, perhaps landscape, archaeological, or architectural photographs, dominate the examples in our corpus that are drawn from the American Academy in Rome. Now, I want to stress that these questions about institution type in relation to cataloging terms were not in view when we formed the corpus, and moreover, these charts don't represent all the photos in a given collection. So I'm not making any specific claims or drawing any firm conclusions from these visualizations. However, based on this example, one can imagine a means of studying, for example, the relationship between photos with one figure and the use of the term portrait across institutions of various types. In any case, the ability to study information systems seems very relevant to a corpus of images drawn from 19th century photographic albums, both because of their significance vis-a-vis structuring relationships across photos, and because of the time period of photo Unbound, which spans roughly 1840 to 1930. In this period in Europe and North America, and perhaps elsewhere, the increasing use of photographic practice in art, science, and industry was gradually reshaping how professionals and the public understood any number of concepts, including portrait. In the US, from 1839 to 1900, for example, as photo historian Sarah Blackwood recounts in her 2019 book, The Portrait's Subject, photography helped prompt a cultural shift whereby portraiture was understood to represent not only physical appearance, but a subject's interior life, their quote-unquote soul. There's yet another layer of meaning in the use of the term portrait that is relevant to our corpus. In the case of this example, portrait of a woman wearing a veil, the brackets indicate that the term was ascribed by the owning repository. The photo appears in an album acquired by the Getty in 1984. The date the museum's photography collection was founded. In the 1980s at the Getty Museum, as in many museums seeking to establish such a collection around the same time, curators were keen to elevate photography to the status of art. Applying the artistic term portrait to photos like these was one way of doing so. All this means that the concept of portrait was evolving over the very period that Photo Unbound focuses on. The term's meaning both shapes and was shaped by many of the photos in the corpus. All these specific understandings of the term mingle within and across the collection's data. Extrapolating from this example, we can imagine that each element of data potentially represents a kind of snapshot of culturally, historically, and institutionally specific notions of what meaning a photograph conveys and how. And as these notions are baked into institutional infrastructures, including search interfaces on a larger and larger scale, the distorting effects of using contingent terms to describe images can be amplified. As we fall back on seemingly fixed and standardized categories, it becomes easier to lose sight of the ways particular photographs do or do not conform to these categories, and of the conceptual messiness of 19th century photography. By temporarily subverting descriptive categories, viewing our corpus sorted by coverage helped me and my collaborators recover the liminal status of 19th century photography and focus our attention on the systems of knowing it inscribed, reinforced, and played a role in reshaping. This high-level global and cross-institutional approach is, however, only partially a function of computer vision. It is also, and at the same time, a function of the mass production of images that both photography and CV represent stages in the evolution of. This connection between CV and photography means that as we use CV to foreground certain characteristics of photography in its early period, we can and should also use photography to help make more visible and more analyzable aspects of CV that, due to our lack of historical distance from it, can be otherwise difficult to see or apprise. Now, computer vision is usually said to have started with a project related to robotics. Computer scientists working at MIT in 1966 sought to teach robots how to receive and process visual input. Yeah, we'll just do this super quickly. It probably will take like a summer, is what they thought. As we now know, teaching computers to see proved more difficult than expected. Like the field of AI more broadly, CV advanced in fits and starts until the advent of machine learning, powered by neural network computing. Within CV research specifically, the approach of training algorithms using pre-labeled sets of images, such as ImageNet, a data set comprised of millions of photos scraped from the internet, has facilitated many of the CV tasks we've been discussing these days, including object recognition and image generation. Machine vision pipelines provide just one example of how computer vision is built on and continues to rely on photography. That is photographs, but also cameras, photographers, and viewing subjects. This reliance on photography is furthermore premised on a specific conception of it. As media scholars Nicholas Malave and Katrina Sluis argue, machine vision, and I would argue computer vision more generally, operates under what they term a latent theory of photography, one in which, quote, photographs are understood to function as self-standing documents, free from the context from which they emerged, and positioned as straightforward visual, quote unquote, samples of the real world. In machine vision, in other words, a picture of a cat and a cat are regarded as the same thing. Building on Malave and Sluis's argument, I would add that this latent theory of photography is more specifically a 19th century one. For example, when Schwartz writes of the belief in the 19th century of the photograph's ability to, quote, transmit across space and across time what were believed to be objective, whole, and self-evident facts in visual form, her words work equally well for describing how images operate within CV processes. CV demonstrates the persistence in the 21st century of 19th century conceptualizations of photography's mechanical objectivity. In addition, CV operationalizes concepts of how images can be used to analyze and understand reality and access quote-unquote truth that were operational in the 18th century in relation to drawings and engravings. The formation and deployment of training data sets requires the labeling of many images, as we know. Teaching a computer to recognize cats in an image or generate a picture of one means showing it many pictures of cats, depicting a variety of species from a variety of angles and in a variety of different settings. This procedure represents the negotiation of attention between standardization and specificity. The question is this: what kinds of images represent accuracy and fidelity to reality, such that they provide access not only to knowledge, but truth? Should we look for the typical specimen, the ideal example? And what does a typical or ideal cat look like? In their 1992 essay, The Image of Objectivity, historians Lorraine Daston and Peter Gallison discuss these ideas in relation to early modern technical images. Quote, in the 18th century scientific atlases, they write, typical phenomenon were those that harkened back to some underlying typus or archetype, and from which individual phenomenon could be derived, at least conceptually. Since the typical or statistically average is never contained within a single exemplar, scientists in this era often created images like this one by Dutch anatomist Bernard Albinus of an archetypal skeleton. This etching is the result of drawings painstakingly made by Albinus of both actual human skeletons and very skinny living models. Parts of those drawings were then combined to create the finished image. As Albinus wrote, quote, I wanted to show an example of nature. I chose to take it from the best pattern of nature, which he defined as, quote, of the male sex, of a middle stature, and very well proportioned, and of the most perfect kind, without any blemish or deformity. By 1900, in part because of photographic processes, including the X-ray, scientists no longer regarded an image like Albinus' skeleton as accurate or truthful. Rather, scientists took photos of many individual examples which were intended to collectively define a type or class. Thus, instead of building variety into a single image, the scientist expected the viewer to look at many, many images and generate associations between them using what Daston and Gallison refer to as, quote, the psychology of pattern recognition. From this thinking, we can trace a line to so-called portraits like these, which were used as tools to define and classify humanity, placing both individuals and groups of people within hierarchical, often racist typologies. We can also draw a line from Albinus's images and typological photos to images like these. On the one hand, we have multiple images of various kinds of cats, which stand in both individually and together as a class of thing, house cat. At the same time, the generated image results from a combination of many, many photos of cats to form a single image of an ideal or archetypal cat. And it's interesting that both the skeleton and the cat are placed in scenes with elaborate decorative details, which seemingly are not perceived to interfere with their truth claims, and maybe they even reinforce it. As these examples demonstrate, the debates regarding mechanical objectivity and the role of images as vehicles of information, tools of analysis, and forms of artistic expression were not sparked by the advent either of photography or AI, but rather intensified by them. This is precisely why I think it's essential for us to contextualize contemporary developments within longer historical trajectories. Among other benefits, such a contextualization helps us discern the relationships between the biases and assumptions we see in the field of AI, those of the culture and values of, for example, scientific disciplines or the commercial sector, and those of humans more broadly. For example, it's not only within the field of CV that people conflate photos of objects with the objects themselves. Popular conceptions of how photographic images function remain predicated on the idea of indexicality, despite a long history of its critique, even in the pre-digital context, and the advent of tools like Photoshop. Yet digital cameras and images, while based on the model of analog photography, have moved further and further away from indexicality over the last 20 to 30 years. While generally speaking, distinguishing a painting or etching from a photograph is an easy task, it can be virtually impossible to discern the relationship between, say, an original or manipulated photo or a generated versus camera-based image. The increasingly non-indexical nature of digital image has been driven by, among other phenomena, CV itself. Advancements in radiance field imaging, texture synthesis, and image generation have fully destabilized the relationship of image to object. Both technically and culturally, digital images function much more like paintings or etchings than they do photography. As a result, the latent theory of photography on which CV is erected is also one it itself is rapidly undoing. I've sketched a picture here of a complicated research ecosystem comprising images, data, objects, systems, and institutions. I don't think anyone could be expected to track all the ways the various aspects of this ecosystem have evolved over time and continue to evolve. I would not expect any repository, for example, to represent the full complexity of information associated with a digital image of a 19th century photograph on a collections object page. Nor do I necessarily expect computer scientists to develop a more nuanced theory of photography. What I do think is important is for researchers, scholars, and information specialists, and indeed all those working with cultural heritage images, first to remain cognizant that this complex and ever-evolving ecosystem exists, and that has a long history that predates computing, much less AI. Second, it's important to remember that all our tools of research have certain intellectual, technological, cultural, political, and other kinds of assumptions built into them. Of course, we know this, but it can be difficult, and for me at least, to not only keep this fact in view, but to instrumentalize it within my research. In the case of CV or AI generally, what these choices are and how they are built into the tools is a process that's evolving really quickly. Historical context has, for me, provided a vital way to track this evolution. In a recent essay, historian and information specialist Stan Cohen remarked on the ways in which the intelligence of AI systems is measured, focusing on tests like Humanity's Last Exam, which is designed to determine when artificial general intelligence has superseded that of human beings. As Cohen writes, quote, "The exam's implicit definition of intelligence is the ability to provide correct answers to complicated questions. When in fact, as he argues, quote, asking good questions is harder than giving great answers." Cohen's argument helps foreground the importance of developing a critical approach to the use of CV for photohistorical research, one that is premised on generating answers and generating questions. To do so requires keeping both photography and CV in view, of instrumentalizing CV not just as a tool, but as itself a practice. Thank you.
Thank you, Emily. So, ending about good questions, open it up to the floor. Questions?
I have a question.
Yeah.
You mentioned that the database that you are, not the database, but the corpus that you are using is made of albums, right?
Yeah.
Are you keeping track of the information relating to the albums in your extractions of images?
You mean physically written into the...
Sorry, I'm trying to be clear, and I don't know how to be clear on this. But these images are coming from pages.
Yeah.
They are associated all together.
Yeah.
All of that is creating meaning
Yeah.
for each of these images.
Yeah.
As soon as you extract them
Yeah.
and isolate them,
Yeah.
you lose this. Mm-hmm. And you explain very clearly that some of these images, could be seen in different contexts in the game.
Yeah.
So I'm assuming that these images, based on what Bart said about, photography, one photograph published in one newspaper is not the same, doesn't have the same meaning than another one. So did you keep information related to the albums where these images are coming from, knowing that part of their meaning is associated to the album they are coming from?
Absolutely.
I made it.
Next question. No.
But you didn't show that to us.
No, because I would say that's something something we're struggling with is how to work through the data. So among the many tools that shape, like any data visualization you put your data into is already like shaping what answers you're getting back and what you can see. And one of the reasons we chose data set is because it's very modest, but it is like very, it's very modest in every way, including how, like what you're seeing. And it's kind of clunky in a way. But, and just to add to what you were saying, like even at the Getty, we can have the same album at the museum and the archive, and not only how it's cataloged, but how it's photographed can be different, and that includes like how the relationship of the pages to the album, like whether the album is cataloged, whether the individual pages are cataloged, whether the photos are cataloged. So all of that, to the extent that it's in the metadata, it's in our data set, and we can always link back to the original object, which also gets tricky because already when I was preparing this, I noticed some dead links and that sort of thing. But part of what so the idea is to take these things, explode them out, and be able to put them back together in that way, and start to understand and study things like sequencing, and see if we can see that across the corpus. But at the same time, so that's the goal, but it's challenging, I would say. And the other thing is I didn't really talk about this, but part of how we framed the project too was this idea. So sometimes within these fields, we've all talked about how important collaboration is, which it absolutely is. But it's also sometimes the case, I feel like, where you have people who've been working in this field who are really specialists in it, working together, and then the sort of mainstream of, let's say, art history who are like not engaging at all. So, and it can feel overwhelming, even if you're interested to know, like, how do you get started? What do you learn? So we wanted to sort of design the project also as a kind of on-ramp for two scholars who don't necessarily work deeply with these technologies. So that was part of it too. So that's part of why we've been also using this kind of more modest technologies. But anyway, just to say, yeah, that's something we've really been, that was always a goal, but it's in some ways been a struggle to actually work that out. And also say we're located in 4 different places. And it turns out when we meet regularly via Zoom, and then like, for example, last summer we were in the same place together, and suddenly we could do so much more being physically in the same place. So that's been a sort of, in some ways we've been able to work, remotely in a wonderful way, but in other ways it's like kind of an impediment, yeah. Speaking of exploding and bringing back together.
Hi, thank you for your presentation. It was awesome. I have one question about finding, since there was several institutions, finding duplicates and variations. What was the case in that, and what was the response of finding duplicates and variations, if there's any?
You mean, well, we have been experimenting with visual similarity to find duplicates and variations, but do you mean?
Literally, because 19th century, there's the spread of 19th century. You can find in the same collection duplicates and variations. So that's where my question is coming from, knowing that there's that case that it can happen. Just wondering about that.
Yeah, so that's something we've done using visual similarity. I think both Alex and David have definitely found duplication across the corpus. What sort of they're making of that or what conclusions they're drawing from that, I can't say. But yeah, that's definitely, and again, specifically the idea that there would be repetition across the corpus and being able to compare, different cataloging practices was part of the goal, but no grand conclusions yet. I don't know if you had a specific, dimension of duplication that you were interested in, or...
Going with portraits, I was just wondering, in that setting of portraits, when you find duplicates and variation, was that in that revision that I was done, if there was one that it was maybe same photograph, but it wasn't
one
included.
Called a portrait in one case and not a portrait in the other, or something like that. Yeah. I haven't been, this is really pretty new, these insights about portraiture, so I haven't been able to do that yet, but that would be the next step, absolutely, yeah. Dear.
Thank you, that was really great. I was looking at the results, and it was so intriguing that some of them where it said person, and then a few of them it says sculpture.
Yeah.
And can you talk, it just seems like both an error and not, and maybe insightful error, and I just was intrigued by that. Yeah.
Yeah, that's something we've looked at too, and different treatments of, especially like painted walls, and when it confuses sculpture for people and when it doesn't. And one of the reasons we turned to person detection and away from some other things was also because of, the 19th century being this period where there's all these different processes, and so the prints look really different, and also how they're digitized can be really different. And in some cases, not only is there duplication within the corpus, for example, but we can have the same photograph in the same institution that was digitized. And we have 2 versions of a digitized version of it, like an older version and a newer version. It will find different things in the 2 photos. And sometimes it's worse on the newer digitized photos, for example. But so that's something we're looking into as well.
So something you just said is really interesting to me. It's the second time I've heard someone in this symposium allude to more recent, and I'm assuming higher quality scans as potentially causing more problems for AI. What is that, do you think? Is that an overload of information, of data? Is it harder to parse? Is it harder to, to run a simple test on an image when there's so much more information competing? I'm curious.
Well, there's I think, a broader point to be made that often in the case of computer vision, you don't want to use your high-res images in part because of just the processing time it takes. But I also think, so you have digitization evolving, you have computer algorithms evolving. And so sometimes I think it can be hard to see or understand where in that, what's happening within the process that's causing that. I keep saying, so I don't know. But I do think it's a good thing to remember that it isn't the case that higher resolution photographs necessarily produce. Well, and in general, more information does not necessarily mean more knowledge.
It's also suggestive of something maybe I'm reading in, but it seems suggestive to me that we don't need to be so careful about the quality of our files in order to use AI. Not
That's
that we
true.
wouldn't want high, but I can imagine that a library might have a collection of high-quality photocopies, and they could batch scan them, by using a feeder, and then do AI on them, and it would probably be cheap and pretty fast. Is that correct?
I mean, it depends on, again, the algorithm, what you're looking for in the photos,
Right.
but yeah, potentially, yeah.
That's amazing, because I think for us, that was a huge challenge, was if we're going to go through all of this effort and we're going to scan and then we're going to do AI, then we need to get it all very much right, and we need to do it once. We're not going to have another chance. We're not going to have more money. And then, of course, it takes years. And it's also...
And by the time you finish all the everything you started with has changed sometimes, yeah.
Yeah, though that's partly we're trying to avoid, right? Is if we get out ahead of obsolescence a little bit, then these things, the digital files have value longer. But if I'm hearing you correctly, they may not actually be.
I think there's so many variables. The other example I will use is from our Edgewater Streets of Los Angeles project, where we had 140,000 images of these photographs of LA streets from the 1960s to the 2010s. And we sent it through Google Vision's API, I think 4 years ago. And first of all, it's kind of limited in its utility because it comes back with, if you know what the images look like, there are a lot of black and white images of facades of buildings that line LA streets. And the tags are things like building, monochrome, car. So in terms of discovery, they're not necessarily super useful. And so more recently, we decided to send some back through to see, advances in 4 years. Surely we'll get a lot more back. In fact, it did worse. And we theorize it's partly because in the early days, once a lot of bias was found, there's all this stuff happening in the background. When you say search for a doctor, it's search for a doctor of color, so that it is correcting the results and sort of suppressing anything that might be perceived as problematic. So I think that's something to keep in mind as well.
Hi, this is a bit of a naive question, but you mentioned that you'd give the prompt, you'd teach CB about all cats, it takes it from photographs, and then when you give the prompt, this is the cat it comes up with.
Well, one example of one AI generator came up with this.
Yeah, but I'm thinking most of the images that it would learn from would not be black cats, would not be sitting elegantly, would be, in funny positions. So how does it, and not in that kind of setting.
Yeah.
So how does it decide which one to present? And and also my question is does this cater to a human desire for something? I
would say, broadly speaking. I mean, my understanding is we don't know. I mean, I think there are people in here that would maybe know better the technical side of this. But in terms of why it shows a black cat in this setting, I can tell you that I should have included. So I just went into WhatsApp, which now is an AI generator, and I said, "Show me a cat," because I was curious, because kind of what we're seeing in the same way that this is this ideal skeleton, we're saying, show me a picture of catness, not just a cat, but the idea of cat. When I put it, and then I did it right away again, show me cat, same prompt, very different image of like, I don't actually know much about cats, but it was like Angora, and it was much more of like a suburban interior of a home kind of scene with like, but it was similarly dramatically lit. So, I think, and CV works as a black box kind of arrangement where as the algorithm, you're training it to show cats, and as it's spitting things out, you say, yes, more like that and less like that. So I think it is shaped by human desire in the sense of like the people training their algorithm. It's based on what their idea of catness is to some extent. And of course, in something like WhatsApp, there may be some reason that they want it to be especially evocative or especially interesting looking. So yeah, that's what I would say to that.
On that same note, last year I went to something, Distillery District Windows was putting on something like that.
Please use this, because we won't be able to have you,
I always fool myself thinking I have a deep voice. Yeah, last year I went to something at Distillery District, and Windows people had something similar, and they had a cat, and the cat came out that regal as well. Right? So it's something to do with the system.
Yeah. I would also say, because of course, these algorithms are trained on contemporary images. And so it's difficult with older images because it's not going to recognize, someone talked about like cell phones in early, in 1910, like it's going to, but it's also, it seems like that something like ImageNet, it's a snapshot in time as well. And as the internet itself gets more populated with generated images and manipulated images, you're not going to be able to create another ImageNet, at least in the same way, because you can't just, if you scrape the internet, you're going to get a bunch of generated images. And so ImageNet itself, we're always maybe going to be able to do really good on images from whatever, 2020 to 2030, but then not be able to do, I'm exaggerating to make a point, but, and that's something I think to keep in mind as well. We're sort of undermining our own ability to do this actively all the time.